It's my turn. I don't see any Baylor shirts. What's the matter with this crowd? Last night I took a hard hit at the deacons meeting about my picks. Not picking Baylor to win the championship. But, if you're a lifelong Southern Baptist, it's hard to see Baylor in the last big dance. So I didn't pick them.
I don't think you hit a home run here either, Pastor.
No. Yeah, some of those guys kind of upset with me, picking a Catholic school to beat the Baylor Bears. Oh, well. I had an aunt that quit sending me Christmas cards when I didn't go to Baylor. Yeah, I did. The Baylor family, and I messed up and didn't go there. All right, we're going to talk about God's responses to our prayers, and welcome to those that are joining us online. And I'm going to give you categories. Obviously, there are jillions of different answers that God gives to prayers, but we're just going to talk about some categories that they fit into. And the first thing I want to tell you is that for a believer, there's no such thing as unanswered prayer. Every prayer of a believer has an answer. And that allows you to say, sometimes God says no. And we say, oh, God didn't answer my prayer. He said no. Yeah, he answered. He said no. I mean, that's an answer, isn't it? I mean, you've given that as an answer, and people have given that to you as an answer, and we accept that as an answer. Or sometimes God says, wait, and that's an answer. I think I may have used the illustration previously about Garth Brooks' song, Thank God for Unanswered Prayer. And he wrote it about going back to his high school reunion and seeing the girl that he had dated in high school and prayed that he could marry her. And he goes back, 25, 30 years later and takes a look and says, thank God for unanswered prayer. He didn't marry her. Well, that's a popular country and western song, or it was, but it's not theologically correct. There's no such thing. And we're as guilty as he is. I mean, it's been a while probably since you sang Have Faith in God when your prayers are unanswered. Nice hymn, just not biblical. So we're going to look at categories with the understanding that while sometimes God is silent, that too is an answer. Just like it was with your kids. When you didn't want to answer or you didn't have an answer, you just kept being quiet. And they said, you didn't answer my request. You did. You answered it with silence. So there's always an answer. It's just determining how God is answering prayer. So the easiest one to start with is that sometimes God says no. And there are numerous biblical examples to that. Two would-be followers of Jesus, when he said, follow me, one of them said, let me first go bury my father. And Jesus said, no. Request denied. Another one said, let me first go home and say goodbye. And Jesus said, no. You follow me now or you don't follow me at all. A mother requested of Jesus that her son sit on either side of him, one on the right, one on the left. Jesus said no. Maybe you remember Elijah. When things didn't go well for him, he prayed, Lord, just let me die. And God said, no, not time for you to die yet. And if you read the next few chapters, you see what all Elijah would have missed if he'd have died. God had some things still for him and through him. So there are answers in the Bible that justify us saying sometimes God says no. And even if there weren't biblical examples, we would have numerous testimonies that God said no. My lifelong friend Jim Ulrich, I'd known him since we were 14 years old, lived down the street from each other, did all kinds of things together that teenage boys do, and he was a groomsman in our wedding. And he got back from Vietnam and started selling cars over in East Texas, and I bought cars from him. I mean, we were such good friends that I would call him and say, I need a new car. He'd say, okay, I'll let you know when I got one for you. And I'd go over and buy it without even seeing it or driving it. I mean, that's how much I trusted him. So I was in Vancouver, and my cell phone rang, and it was Jim Ulrich, and he said, I need you to pray. I said, what's going on? He said, the doctor says I don't have long to live. Well, that came out of the blue. Just all of a sudden, he got sick, and he went in for a checkup, and he had terminal cancer in its last stages, and he said, I need you to pray. And I said, I'm going to pray for you, for sure, but I'm going to pray that I get home in time to come over and see you, because we need to talk at least one more time. So, okay. And that's specifically what I prayed. Lord, please, I'm going home at the end of this week. I'll go over there next week. Please keep him alive and alert and so forth. Let's talk one more time. He died before I got home. And on the way home, I got the call saying he asked for you to preach his funeral, so I didn't have to preach his funeral. But it was a no answer. I clearly asked God for something, and God said no. And I suppose if this were a talkative group, which it is not, every time I ask you something, you just kind of look at me. If I got you to talking, you would probably all have an example in your own life of when God said no. And some of them would be dramatic, and some of them would be very simple. But, we've all experienced where we wanted something and we asked God for it, and God said, no, that's not the way it's going to be. So even Jesus in Gethsemane, Lord, let this cup pass from my lips. Now, there's only one commentary I ever saw that said that was anything other than Jesus praying that the cross could be postponed. And it was a pretty liberal commentary that I didn't pay much attention to anyway, but I was looking at it, and I forget what it said now. But nearly everybody agrees that Jesus was praying that the cross could be postponed. Not deleted, because he knew that was the Father's plan from the beginning, but postponed. And why would he want it postponed? Because the Scripture says these certain Greeks had come looking for him. Well, here's a whole new door open for the gospel. He could go off with these Greeks and have a wonderful ministry there. So he's praying, let this cup pass. And God said no. The crucifixion is going to come just on scheduled time, just like we planned it before creation. What do you do when you get a no answer from God? Let me give you 4 suggestions. Number 1, rejoice that God heard your prayer. There are millions and millions of people in this world tonight who pray to God's little g, gods who don't hear. So I had a friend who was from another world religion who said to me, I'm praying for you. I said, I have a question for you. To whom are you addressing your prayer? And they had no answer. So I don't suppose they got a very good answer if they weren't heard. So even though we get a no answer, we can be thankful and rejoice that we have a God who hears our request. Pray again. This is the second thing you can do. You can pray again. You can ask God the same thing. But ask him to teach you in the midst of that no answer. It's okay to ask God why. Why do you say no? What is it that you're trying to say to me by refusing my request? Third thing you can do is to evaluate your prayer. See if it's in keeping with God's will. Maybe not. You know, James writes in James 4:3 that sometimes we ask and receive not because we ask amiss. So maybe when I get a no answer, I need to go back and look through that again and say, I wonder where I went wrong. What was I asking that was not in keeping with what God wanted for my life for this day? And the fourth thing is that you can allow God to work in your life through the no answer. And again, we've all either have illustrations of that or we know of illustrations in somebody else's life. And Elijah was certainly one of those. God, just let me die. No, I'm not through with you yet. And the Apostle Paul was one of those. Remember, Paul's prayer was, Lord, remove this thorn in the flesh. And some of you probably know what that was, but theologians have argued for years over what the thorn in the flesh was. Whatever it was, Paul didn't like it, and he asked God to remove it. God said no. And God wasn't through with Paul, obviously. That comes, that question and answer comes in 2 Corinthians, which is, he wrote a lot of letters after 2 Corinthians. So obviously God wasn't through with Paul. So the fourth thing you can do when God says no, what Paul was doing was saying, why? What is there in my life that causes you to say no to that? And you got an answer. God said, my grace is sufficient for you. So that's the first possible answer, and these are in no particular order, except you just got to start somewhere, and until we get the worst one out of the way quick. So how does God respond to our prayers? Sometimes he says no. So let's get to a better one. Sometimes he says yes. Unless any of you want to ask a question about the no answers. I doubt it, but at least I'll give you a chance. Speak up. All right, sometimes God says yes. And obviously we like those better. And there are numerous, again, biblical examples of that. Acts 4:31, when they had prayed, the place where they had gathered was shaken. I would take that as a yes answer. God responded in a very positive way. Elijah prayed that it wouldn't rain, and it didn't rain for 3 years and 6 months. Pretty good yes answer. And then he prayed for rain, and it came, like they say in West Texas, a gully washer. It rained. Psalmist says of God, you've given him his heart's desire. Sometimes God says yes. Stephen, Acts 7. I was reading that earlier today because in that Bible reading group that some of you joined, we were doing Acts, and today's the 6th and tomorrow's the 7th, so we're on Acts 7. And I was looking at it, and Stephen says, Lord, receive your servant. He's dying. He's been stoned to death. Receive your servant. And God says, okay, yes. Come on up. Come on in, whatever you say. Yes answers. Here's my favorite one. Jabez. Oh, how I wish I had written that book. That guy made a fortune on a little old verse, an obscure verse in the Old Testament that I had taught in class as an example of a yes answer. Jabez prayed that God would enlarge his territory. And God did. Now, it's nothing more than an example of a yes answer, unless you wrote the book. And then it's T-shirts and hats and, and bookmarks and refrigerator magnets and, spin-off books. I actually developed a sermon on that. It's no longer worth preaching because most people don't know what the prayer of Jabez is anymore. But it was so popular that this guy just made fortunes. He wrote a book called The Prayer of Jabez's Wife. And of course, it was all this stuff he made up. The Prayer of Jabez's neighbor, Jabez. I think he said the Prayer of Jabez's neighbor, Jabez. Made up. Prayer of Jabez for teens. Supposedly written on a teenage level. I think I just made a fortune. It's a good example of a prayer that God said yes. I'm not sure what all Jabez wanted, whether he was talking about land or influence. I don't know. Increase my territory. And God gave him what he asked. So there are a lot of biblical examples for the fact that when you pray, sometimes God answers yes and grants your request. So let me give you a personal example. Several years ago, I was invited by the International Mission Board to do an around-the-world prayer journey. 3 weeks. We went through China, Yemen, I mentioned that in the illustration Sunday morning, India, out through Western Europe. We touched where all the world's major world religions are. That's why those places were picked. In that group, Calvin Miller. Some of you may recognize the name. He wrote 50 books. At the airport at DFW, his wife came up to another guy and myself, and she said, "Please watch out for Calvin." We thought she was joking. We just kind of laughed. By the end of the first week, we were taking turns watching out for Calvin. He's 6'4", and if he hadn't been 6'4", we'd have lost him in China. He'd wander off 2 or 3 blocks away from us, and then you could see him, because Chinese people aren't very tall. So we are set to leave India, Bhubaneswar. We're going to ride the all-night train into the Khan Hills, and from there, after a day with missionaries there, we were going to fly to Delhi. We leave the hotel, we go to the train station, we're getting out of the cab, and Calvin says, "I don't have my passport." No time, no place to lose your passport. For one thing, a U.S. passport on the black market in India is worth a small fortune, probably more than that cab driver's salary. If he had gotten it. We didn't know where it was. It's gone. Cab's gone. Can't go back to the hotel. Train's coming. All we know to do is say, "Well, Calvin, let's go. When we get to Bhubaneswar, we'll put you on a plane. You can fly to Delhi and go to the embassy and work on it. We'll pick you up there on our way out." So we prayed about it. God, you know Calvin. And you know where his passport is. Could you please get he and his passport back together? God said yes. So Calvin went on to Delhi without us. Meanwhile, the cab driver took the passport back to the hotel and dropped it off at the desk. The hotel manager called another American who was staying in the hotel. After all Americans know each other, right? "Do you happen to know a guy named Calvin Miller?" And the other guy happened to be a missionary. He said, "Yeah, I was just with him today." He said, "Well, I got his passport." And the guy said, "Well, I think they were going to Delhi." And I'll take it. I'm going to Delhi. Long story short, Calvin Miller gets off the plane in Delhi, New Delhi, India. He's coming down the ramp, and this guy's holding his passport, saying, "Are you Calvin Miller? Here's your passport." And God said yes. We still had to watch out for him every day. Sometimes God just says yes. And again, if we went around the room, we'd get however many people there are here, that many testimonies as to some time in your life where you prayed for something, either for yourself or somebody else, and God just answered. He just gave you exactly what you asked for. Sometimes God says yes. Sometimes God says wait. It's biblical. A woman of Cana asked Jesus to heal her daughter. And he said, wait. I don't think he said that word, but that's what happened. He didn't do it. He didn't answer. To the point that the disciples were intervening on her behalf and saying, why haven't you answered her? He's told her to wait. The disciples, after they had seen Jesus alive, were ready to go tell the whole world. You remember what Jesus told them? Wait here in Jerusalem until you've been filled with the power from on high. That is a tough wait answer. I mean, that was the pep talk that stirs up the team, and then the coach says, sit down, stay in the locker room a while longer. Just wait. Sometimes God says wait. It's biblical. The Apostle Paul struck down on the road, realizes what God's up to. In the 9th chapter of Acts, what would you have me do, Lord? And we've got the number one persecutor of Christians has just become a Christian, and everybody wants him on the program. This is a big testimony. I mean, he goes on the Billy Graham crusade. This guy's got a testimony. He just converted from persecuting Christians to being the leader. And you remember what God did? He sent him to Arabia. We're not sure how long. Arabia Seminary. Just go down there and wait. Send him to the desert to wait. That's the answer to Paul's prayer, what would you have me do? Probably something like 3 years. He had to wait until God gave him another answer. So sometimes that wait answer is, there's another answer coming, but for now, you have to wait. Well, let me be fair to B.B. McKinney. Have faith in God when your prayers are unanswered. Your earnest plea he will never forget. Wait on the Lord. Trust his word and be patient. Have faith in God. He'll answer yet. That may be the hardest answer of all for the younger generation. And to some extent, us. Although, the more mature you get, the more you learn how to wait. You don't learn how to like it, but you learn how to wait. But the younger generation gets frustrated when the microwave doesn't go fast enough. And they define a split second as the amount of time that elapses between the light turning green and the horn behind you honking. We don't like waiting. So this may be the hardest answer for the younger group to deal with, when God says, wait. We just want it right now. Tell me no, but tell me something. So here's the personal illustration for wait. Josh and Lisa Arrington are church planters in metropolitan Vancouver. She was a student of mine. He was a student minister. Iowa Park. You know Josh and Lisa? That's right. I saw them on your Facebook friend thing one time. I was going to ask you about that. Okay, well, you know probably this whole story. Anyway, Lisa said, you keep talking about Vancouver in class. What do you know about it? I said, how much time you got? Talk about it. She said, well, God's called me to Vancouver, but he hadn't called Josh. I said, well, we need to work on that. She said, let's you and me covenant together, and let's pray Josh into Canada. Done. I had another place that I thought God wanted him to go, but that didn't, they ended up somewhere else. But he resigns. They take off across country with both sets of parents, kids, to church start in Metro Vancouver, Pitt Meadows. And they're turned down at the border. Not only can you not cross this border, you can never cross this border, they said to him. Don't try to come back tomorrow. We'll put you in jail. You're not crossing this border. Part of that was a border agent who didn't understand and didn't think they needed more churches. After all, they got some. Why do we need another one? And they were devastated. Got some connections made, went back into Seattle. A church put them up for a few days. They prayed hard. Parents were saying, see, told you, take my grandkids off. We're like that. I mean, it was tough. They were wrestling with God. We talked about travail last week. They were into that. Okay, God, we're going back. The risk of going to jail, we're going back to the border. God had said, wait. To go back to the border, as they're getting out of the car, an agent comes out of the building and says, can I help you folks? Yes. And they told him the story. He says, follow me. He goes in, have a seat. He goes in the little office. A few minutes, he comes back out. Here's your passport. Ray Woodard was their supervisor. He had come to the border to meet them, hopefully not to go to jail with them. And he turns to the border agent and he says, can I ask you what just happened? And the agent said, yeah. He said, my dad's a church planter. I know what they're doing. And the other day they got somebody that didn't know what they were doing. And I know what they're doing. And Ray said, so you're the one that happened to be here today. He said, yeah, strange thing. He said, I don't work the border. I work downtown in the shipping. He said, I filled in for a guy today. And I was going home. I just happened to come by your car, and God seemed to say, stop messing. Meanwhile, back in Pitt Meadows, while God was saying wait, they lost the lease to their apartment. Now they're across the border and they got nowhere to stay. And they quickly found another co-op kind of apartment, moved their stuff in, got their parents on their way back, and he goes by the office, and this lady that's managing the apartment says, so you're here to start a church? Yes, ma'am. I've been praying for you guys for a long time. Where are we going to start that church? Now it's we. Where are we going to start that church? And Josh said, well, we're not quite ready yet. We just got here. And she said, well, what are we waiting on? Well, we don't have a place to meet. She said, we got a community room here. You can use it. Well, we don't know anybody. She said, you know me? I know everybody lives here. We got lots of kids. We can do something with kids. And she's starting planning these programs for him. Why are they in this cooperative housing place? Because where they were going wasn't where God wanted them, and God said, wait, let them cancel your lease. And that was the first of many, many Josh and Lisa stories that I could tell you of how God has directed. And they're still there, and they're still planting churches, spin-off churches from churches. I used to ask my students in evangelism class, how big do you think a church needs to be to start another church? And you get answers like, 200? Let me tell you about a church in Pitt Meadows, British Columbia, that got up to 25 and split off and started another church. Because God told them to. That's a long other story, but they started that other church, and they come to the Baptist General Convention of Texas to represent the partnership and run into a guy in the men's room who thinks maybe God's calling him to Canada to start a church. And he's pastoring a church out in West Texas. And long story short, he's up there now starting the spin-off church, which is now larger than the mother church, and spinning off another church. That's how we start churches in Canada. Sometimes God says, wait. And it's not panic time when God says wait. You just have to wait. How do you wait on God? Expectantly. One author says standing on tiptoe to see what God's going to do next. Persistently. Romans 12:12 talks about continuing in prayer, and the Revised Version says persisting in prayer. And don't quit praying, just wait and pray. And wait on God to do what God does in God's timing. Sometimes God says wait. Now, here's an answer that doesn't have any biblical background to it, or at least any I can identify without stretching the point too far. And sometimes God says we'll see. And I base that on, my kids told me that was always my favorite answer to everything they ask. We'll see. And then along comes a granddaughter, and she says, you need to update your terminology. The word is chill. Okay. However you want it. We'll see, chill, whatever. Again, no real biblical evidence for that, but there's a little bit of difference between wait and we'll see. Wait means there's an answer coming. Sometime. We'll see means your request may be irrelevant. We may not even need to answer it. Example, we'd hardly finished opening Christmas packages one year when my kids said, next Christmas, can we go see Uncle Bob in Nashville? And guess what I said? I finally got an answer out of this group. When I told you the answer. We'll see. You see, if I had said yes or no, I'd have been wrong either way. Because between that Christmas and the next Christmas, Uncle Bob married Aunt Linda and moved to Memphis. So if I said yes, I'd been wrong. We wouldn't be going to Nashville. If I'd have said no, I'd have been wrong because we went to Memphis to be with Uncle Bob and Aunt Linda Christmas time. So we'll see. It means chill. That's what it means. I think sometimes God just says, things may change to where your request is not even necessary anymore. So just chill. I don't know how else to do that. Circumstances change. And we have learned, should have learned by now for sure, that everything God does in the fullness of time. So when we ask something that's out of sync with God's fullness of time, then that's the kind of answer that's just wait, except may not need an answer to that. And again, even without a lot of biblical examples. I suspect you've had one of those kind of answers too, where you keep asking God for something and then all of a sudden you don't need to ask that anymore. Irrelevant. So here's an interesting answer. Sometimes God says, what about this? And that's when his answer is different from your request, but it's in response to your request. Now this gets a little bit tricky. Psalm 106:15. God gave them their request, but sent a wasting disease among them. I doubt seriously if anybody prayed for a wasting disease, whatever that was. But that's what they got. Something different from what they asked. And there are other numerous examples. When God exceeds our request, the answer is a bit different from our request. Book of Acts, again. Acts, is it 16? No, Acts 12. 12th chapter of Acts. Remember when Peter got put in prison? Verse 5, Acts 12:5. Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. What do you think they were praying? And just common sense. What would that church be praying for with Peter in prison? That he'd get out? Yeah. I mean, if they were bold in their prayer, just go ahead and pray that he'd get out. He got out. Verse 9. So we went out and followed him. Didn't know what had been done by the angel. Remember, the angel opened the gates and let him out. And he shows up at the meeting of the church in the house. And they're praying. He came to the house of Mary, this is verse 12, came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, John Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And again, we think they would be praying for him to get out of prison. Peter knocked at the door of the gate, and a girl named Rhoda, one of my favorite characters in all the Bible, Rhoda, bless her heart. A girl named Rhoda came to answer. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she didn't open the gate. Poor Peter, he's outside. She ran in and announced that Peter stood at the gate. When she recognized, it's the same verse. But they said to her, you're beside yourself. Yet she kept insisting that it was so. And so they said, it's his angel. Excuse me, what were they praying? They get out. He's out. He's at the gate. And Rhoda's trying to convince them he's there. And they're saying, nah. So God gave them something a little different than what they were asking for. He just showed up. He's at the gate. Now that goes on. You can read the rest of the chapter. And poor Rhoda, she just has a hard time. And poor Peter, he's standing out there knocking, and they're not letting him in for a while. Now they may have also been praying for some other things. They could have been praying for his safekeeping. They could have been praying for his health. We're not sure what all they might have prayed. But whatever else they prayed, God said, what about this? How about I just let him out? Sometimes that's how God works. Another good biblical example is the parable of the prodigal son. He comes to himself, comes back home, saying to himself, I'm going to go home. My father's got servants that are eating better than I am. I'm going to go home. I'm going to ask the father to make me like one of the servants. And you read that passage and you get down to where he's trying to ask his father, he never gets through the request. The father interrupts everything. He said, this is my son. He was lost and now he's found. So put a ring on his finger. That was a symbol of authority. Put shoes on his feet. Only slaves went barefoot. Kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a party. The request was, make me one of your servants. The answer was, what about this? How about if we just restore you to your position? Sometimes that's the way God responds. Sometimes it's different from the request. Sometimes it's better than the request. And you may or may not agree with this one, but sometimes it's a negotiation with God. Can we change God's mind? That was usually good for one good class day's discussion. Debate, disagreement. Can our prayers actually change God's mind? King Manasseh, remember him? No? 2 Chronicles 33:9. So Manasseh seduced Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. You keep reading and God says, I'm going to destroy him. It's all over for Manasseh. The same story is being told in 2 Kings, both historical kind of references. And it talks about Manasseh, so I will forsake the remnant of my inheritance, deliver them into the hand of their enemies. They shall become victims of plunder to all the enemies because they've done evil in my sight, have provoked me to anger since the day their fathers came out of Egypt, even to this very day. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood till he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, besides his sin by which he made Judah sin in doing evil in the sight of the Lord. So Manasseh has had it. Until you get to verses 12 and 13 of 2 Chronicles 33, where God says, I'm going to spare Manasseh. In response to their prayers, the God who said, I'm going to take care of him, I'm going to kill him. Now God says, I've decided to spare him. Remember Jonah? God told Jonah, go to Nineveh and preach. And here's the message I want you to preach. 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. And Jonah goes to Nineveh and he preaches that message. In 40 days, God is going to destroy you. And you get to the 3rd chapter of Jonah and God says, I've decided not to destroy them. And Jonah gets mad. You made a fool out of me, God. Well, I don't know if Manasseh changed God's mind. I don't know if Jonah changed God's mind or the people of Nineveh changed God's mind, but God's mind changed from what he said he was going to do to what he actually did. You can find the same thing with King Hezekiah in 2 Kings 20, where it's time for Hezekiah to die, and he calls out to God and said, please let me live. And God says, okay, I will add 15 years to your life. I don't have a good answer to that, except that God changed what he said he was going to do. And in the process, people were asking God to change. And he did. I don't know, all the seminary professors you had come through here, did Dr. McGorman ever preach here? Anybody remember Dr. Jack McGorman? New Testament professor. He had a great British accent because he was from Nova Scotia. Dr. McGorman inherited his grandkids, adopted them, and asked God to let him live longer than normal. He'd had a number of heart problems and a number of things that kept him teaching at Southwestern instead of going to the mission field, which where he thought God had called him. But his prayer was to give him long life so he could be, in his latter years, the father of these grandkids. I don't know what God ever told him to start with, but when was it? December? Dr. McGorman celebrated his 100th birthday. So, what would have normally happened for a man who'd had all kind of heart trouble and other kinds of problems to die somewhere along the way, and he asked God to let him live, and he's 100 years old and he's still alive. Sometimes, you see, Amos prayed, "O Lord God, forgive, I beg you. How can Jacob stand? He's so small." And God relented, Amos 7. Said it shall not be. And the New American Standard says God changed his mind. Like I said, I don't know what you're going to do with that. but at least this much we know, that when God said he was going to do one thing, he ended up doing something else. And in the meantime, people were praying that God would change and do something else. If nothing else, it encourages us to go ahead and pray boldly. To pray for healing when doctors say no, not going to happen. To pray for life when it appears that life's not going to happen. Just to go boldly to the throne of grace, as the writer of Hebrews says. Because even though somebody said that's not going to happen, and maybe God is saying that's not going to happen, we've got biblical evidence that at least from our perspective, God's changing his mind. Now, I have a feeling when we get to heaven, we're going to find out that that's what God planned all along. That he wasn't changing his mind, he was just testing us, playing with us a little bit. I don't know. So nothing else tonight, I stirred that up, and you can go home and work on that one a little bit. But here's the sixth one, the sixth possible category. Sometimes God says, you got to be kidding. And God does that sometimes when our faith is too small. Ephesians 3 says that God will do in response to our prayers exceedingly, abundantly, beyond all that we ask or even think. That's pretty good. I mean, I would be thrilled to have a God who would consistently do exceedingly more than I ask. But exceedingly abundant. Wow. I'd be good with that. But exceedingly abundant beyond all that we ask or even think. Sometimes when our faith is so small, I think God's response is, you got to be joking. That's all. That's all you want. I've got a whole lot more for you. That's all you want. And other times it's because our self-confidence is too large. I don't know if you've noticed about churches, and surely not this church, but other churches, that sometimes we ask God for things that we know we can produce if he doesn't come through. We set goals like that. And I'm not going to tell you where, but I've been interim pastor of one church that set their high attendance goal. I didn't even know it was high attendance Sunday. They announced it. Next Sunday, high attendance Sunday. Yes, sir, we're going to have 450 next Sunday. So after the service, I asked somebody, where'd you get that goal? Well, that's what we had last year. You had 450 last year for high attendance Sunday, and you set a goal of 450? No, actually, we had 440. We're asking God for 10 more. I said, forget God, I can get you 10 more. It's called the law of large numbers. And it's proven over and over in the telemarketing world. You contact 1,000 people, 100 of them will like what you're selling or giving away, and 10 of them will respond positively. We used to start churches that way, on the phone. There's a whole workbook on the phones for you, is what it's called. And a guy in telemarketing career designed it to start churches. And you called 10,000 people on the phone. That's a pretty good job. 10,000 people. And you get 1,000 of them that say, yes, send me your materials. I'm interested in your church. And on Startup Sunday, you'll have 100 people there. And it worked over and over and over until everybody started screening their phone calls and we got cell phones and we no longer could do telephone outreach. Law of large numbers. I said, don't bother God with that. I can handle that for you. Yes.
So was that God saying no?
I think it was God saying, you got to be kidding. You just want 10 more than last year. Oh, you have little faith.
No, I meant getting the cell phones where you couldn't do it.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, probably so. And we ran our course on that method. How's that poem go? Principles are something, methods are few. I don't know the poem. Something about principles stay the same, but methods are always changing. Always changing. And we need to find out what the methods are and work them to the hilt. And when those methods don't work anymore, let's find some new ones. Unfortunately, churches get stuck on a method and they use it forever. And it's quit working So yeah, you can't use the telephone anymore to reach people. Well, I was at another church that did the same thing with their Lottie Moon goal at Christmas time. They set it at $15,000, and I said, how'd you come up with that? Well, that's what we gave. We've always given $15,000. That was a year that the International Mission Board was really struggling, and they had asked churches to up at a certain percentage. I don't remember now exactly what the percentage was, but, to think about giving so much more. And as it turned out, that so much more for them would have been a $20,000 goal instead of $15,000. I said, why don't you set a $20,000? Oh, we can never give that much. Well, set it. What if you only get halfway there? Well, you still reach more than you've ever reached. So why not? Okay, well, it's 20,000. The longer I stay as an interim, the more authority I get. See? So, all right, we'll do it your way. 20,000. They gave 24,000. But I think in the meanwhile, God's saying, you got to be kidding. 15,000 again? I mean, you're growing, you got more people. Some of them got salary raises. I mean, you got to be kidding. You're stuck on 15,000? Got to be kidding. Okay, so what do we do when God is silent? That may be our fault when it appears that God is silent. Silence is really only a problem in uncomfortable relationships. That's where that phrase, penny for your thoughts, came from. You just can't stand it any longer. Or you're with somebody, especially if it's a new friend, Or if you want to think back, way back when you were dating, and somebody says, "What are you thinking?" And can't stand the silence. What are you thinking? We don't like silence. Sometimes God's silent. And silence doesn't mean absence. As the years go by, we get more comfortable with silence. In fact, as the years go by, we find ourselves needing words even less in relationships. See, we can go somewhere in a car and, I take an exit on the highway and my wife says, "Why are you exiting?" I said, "Because you need to go to the restroom." "Oh, yeah." So we've been married long enough and I know about how far time to exit. You just need words less. You have to talk about it. So sometimes God is silent, and I think when that happens, we need to listen more intently, because the silence may be because of us instead of because of God. He may be speaking and we just don't hear him because we've got certain blocks keep us from listening. Listen more intently, walk more closely. So somebody said, for the ever-present God, silence is an answer. So I don't know how we can deal with that, but that's a possibility. So the truth is, sometimes we don't hear an answer from God. And I'm not sure that's always God's fault. But if it is, we need to listen more intently, walk more closely, pay closer attention to what God's saying, who's he saying it through. Yeah. Okay, we decided in a staff meeting this morning that we're going to go through April and consider ourselves having exhausted the subject on prayer. No. No, we're just going to stop. So 3 more Wednesday nights. Now, on your outline, you're looking down there and you're saying, he's going to stretch that for 3 more Wednesday nights? No, I've got some other things. I've been kicking around what else do I think is needed and appropriate and so forth. But I did a lot of research and planning at the beginning of the pandemic for a message on how to pray in a crisis. And even though the big part of the crisis has kind of moved past us, I think we're always subject to a crisis. So maybe that is something I could deal with. Because there is a real good example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was certainly in a crisis. And we can learn from how he prayed as to how we can pray in a time of crisis. We can always work through the Lord's Prayer. It's a possibility. Also, one thing I enjoy doing, and I just got an invitation yesterday, which makes me think maybe I'll do this next Wednesday, because next Thursday, a week from tomorrow, I'll be on one of those great Zoom calls with the Director of Missions for Harvest Baptist Association, which is Decatur, Bowie, across North Texas that way. Not all the way to Wichita Falls, but you can think of the other little towns that are in there. Boyd, some of the towns that are there. It's that association, and they have an online training school kind of thing once a month. And he wants me to be the guest on that, where he can ask me questions for 30 minutes and then let people ask questions for 30 minutes. And the subject is prayer walking, which has less to do with walking than it does with prayer. That's the point. The idea is to pray without ceasing. And you can do that as you walk, if you walk. You can do it as you jog, if you jog. You can do it as you ride around the car. It just means stay in touch with God. So I've done quite a bit of that and led quite a bit of prayer teams in various parts of the world to do prayer walking or prayer journeying or whatever you want to call it, and that's a possibility. We could talk some about that. I don't know how much interest level you might have in that, but there's several ways we could go. And then I want to come back to the last thing on your outline, because I want to close us out talking about the world. And if we really, really get serious praying, how we always leave ourselves open to spiritual warfare. And if we took the rest of the year, we wouldn't deal with that completely. But we can touch on it and identify how we deal with the devil, because he does not like prayer. And we'll close with that. So 3 more Wednesday nights. You got 2 minutes if you got a question. You got 2 minutes if you don't have a question. Yes, sir.
Talking about people that God had condemned and then changed their mind or intercede, humans had interceded. A couple more examples. Did Moses do that on occasion for the Israelites? I'm trying to remember specifics.
He was the prince of intercession, so.
And I remember when you talked about Hannah one time, King Hannah, and she prayed for
Yeah.
her son, Samuel. So things like that are very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, probably a good illustration in there with Moses. I can't think of one right off the top of my head, but, yeah. Yeah. I can imagine him talking to God, saying, "What do I do now?" It's water, army, help. Yeah. Yeah, I have a section in one section of the class where I talk about the length of prayers. It's kind of fun doing it, because most people will think, the longer the prayer, the better. Nah. Think about how many prayers in the Bible are just help. You got Peter walking on the water and he calls out to God. What does he say? Could you teach me how to swim? No. Save me, quick. Yeah. And I think Moses, help. Yeah. All right, we are done. Thank you, online folks. Thank you, present folks. See you next Wednesday or Sunday.